Every year, thousands of families are torn apart by the disappearance or murder of a loved one. AdvocacyCon, a groundbreaking conference dedicated to the advocacy for missing and murdered victims and their families.
We bring together experts, nonprofit organizations, and the families to create a unified front in the fight for justice.
Our workshops cover topics such as legal support, media engagement, and mental health resources.
Visit our website to learn more. AdvocacyCon, empowering families, fighting for justice.
After an on-again, off-again relationship for 10 years, Heather Strong and Josh Fulgham decided to get married. Less than 2 months later, Heather was missing, but with suspects pointing fingers in different directions, how would a jury decide what really happened? I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines. You heard at the top of the episode a little promo for AdvocacyCon, which is happening in the end of March in Indianapolis. It is a great way for true crime consumers to learn how to work as advocates and for the families of the missing and murdered to learn how to get their own cases in front of the right people. I will not be there this year due to scheduling conflicts with my kids' spring break, but I hope you all go check it out at advocacycon.com. I'll also leave the link in the show notes. This week here on Crimelines, we are going to talk about a case where we know who did it, but there was a fair amount of pointing at the other guy, so we may never know the full truth of what really happened. But that's not what got me interested in this case. I was actually looking up a different case at the time when this one came up because I was looking up death penalty cases. And what caught my attention with this one was the disparity in the sentences between those who were deemed by a jury to be responsible. And we will get into that towards the end of the episode. Obviously, I need to back up and tell you how we get to sentencing. And to do that, we are going to start with Heather Strong. Heather was born in March of 1982 in Mississippi. She was the oldest of 3 children, and her brother told A&E that she was a happy-go-lucky person who was like a second mom to her younger brothers. In high school, Heather had a pretty big friend group, and among those friends was her high school sweetheart, Joshua Fulgham. Heather and Josh dated all through high school, and then not long after Heather graduated, their first child was born. The two had an up-and-down relationship, to put it mildly, and Heather's family did not like Josh. They knew him to be controlling, and eventually that turned to physical abuse. But every time Heather and Josh would break up, they'd be back together within a few weeks or at the very most months. They ended up having a second child together when their daughter was about 5. At some point in the early 2000s, something happened where Josh was ordered to take anger management classes. I can't find a public record for this, so I'm not sure exactly what occurred. But according to Heather's mother, he did not comply with this. Instead, he left Mississippi and moved to Ocala, Florida to be closer to his mom. But even moving a few states away didn't let this breakup stick. After Josh convinced Heather that things would be different in Florida and how their family could start over and be happy, she decided to move out there to be with him. Heather seemed to be clinging to this idea of a happy and stable family for her kids, but there really wasn't any way for that to happen, given that Josh was 1, abusing methamphetamines, 2, abusing Heather, and 3, cheating on her pretty regularly. Every so often, Heather would realize that things were never going to get better. She would break things off, but then they would get back together. How many times have we seen this cycle? The pattern from Mississippi absolutely continued in Florida. And one time when they were broken up in 2007, Josh started seeing someone else, a woman named Amelia Carr. At the time they got together, Josh was 25 and Amelia was 22. She was in their larger friend group, so she knew both Heather and Josh, and she would even help babysit from time to time. Even though she was only 22 years old, she had 3 children already and had recently divorced for the second time. So her life, like Josh and Heather's, had been a bit unstable. But as always would happen, Heather and Josh eventually reconciled, and so he broke things off with Amelia, officially speaking. It sounds like from the reporting that he was still seeing her anytime he and Heather would have a fight and break up for any length of time, and sometimes the relationships would overlap. So Josh, for about 2 years, was not just on and off with his longtime girlfriend Heather, but also Amelia Carr. In September of 2008, Josh and Heather broke up again after she did something she rarely did. Heather reported his abuse. Heather told the police that she was leaving a parking garage when Josh pulled up behind her and began to follow her. In her rearview mirror, she could see him pointing and yelling, and she tried to shake him, but he literally crossed 3 lanes of traffic and ran a stoplight just to stay on her tail. Heather told them that Josh had threatened her life repeatedly, including calling the restaurant where she worked to threaten her there. And this was something that others have said as well. Josh would threaten violence against Heather and didn't seem to care who heard it. He would even seek people out, like one time when he called Heather's mother and said that he had Heather tied up in a trunk and that the alligators were going to eat her alive. Or another time when he called one of the guys Heather dated while they were broken up and threatened to kill both him and Heather. So as of September 2008, when Heather made this report, they were broken up. She was seeing someone else and he was back with Amelia. Amelia even got pregnant with a baby she said was Josh's, and it looked like Heather and Josh might be done for good when, in early December 2008, Josh proposed to Amelia, and she said yes. But then, 3 weeks later, after an argument, Josh took the ring back and disappeared. Amelia waited a few days for him to cool off and come back, but he never did. So she drove over to his house and knocked at the front door only for Heather to answer it. Not only had Josh left Amelia to get back together with Heather, he had given Heather the ring he took from Amelia, and the two had gotten married on December 26th after more than 10 years of this on-again, off-again relationship. Amelia was absolutely devastated, according to her mother. She was a single mom to 3 kids already. Soon she would be a single mom to 4, and she was on her own. But of course, marriage did not fix the issues between Heather and Josh. And so Amelia would soon have a chance to get back together with Josh when this marriage lasted 2 weeks. On January 6th, 2009, Heather went to the police again. She said that Josh had pointed a gun at her and forced her to call the man she had been dating during their last breakup and ask him to meet her somewhere. Josh intended to confront him. And if Heather didn't do this, Josh said he would just shoot her first and then go find and kill the boyfriend anyway. Josh was arrested and charged with aggravated assault over this incident. Since he couldn't make bail, he stayed in lockup for a month. And while he was there, he made a number of calls to Heather and Amelia, trying to get Heather to drop the charges and then venting to Amelia when Heather wouldn't. He was making promises to each of them if they managed to get him out of lockup. And with Amelia, these pleadings got her to act pretty quickly. According to what someone in their friend group witnessed, Amelia demanded Heather drop the charges. Heather refused, and this friend, James, said that Amelia approached Heather from behind, pulled her hair so that her head went back, and put a knife to Heather's throat. James, of course, intervened, pulling Amelia off Heather, and eventually things settled down, with Amelia even apologizing. Heather didn't report this to the police and decided to just try to avoid Amelia. And when it comes to Josh's calls with Heather, they were him making pretty much every promise in the world if she would drop the charges against him. He hated being locked up and he was going stir crazy. But Heather told him, on a recorded call, that she knew that once he got out, he was going to kill her. And she told him she knew from their previous abusive relationship that he was capable of doing it. And Josh even admitted that he was surprised with how big he was, that he hadn't hurt Heather worse than he did in the past. But he promised he would not come after her again. He would promise pretty much whatever it sounded like Heather wanted at that point. He would leave her alone if that's what she wanted. But if she said anything that sounded like maybe they could get back together, that's what he started promising. Whatever it took to get out of jail. Eventually, Heather relented. She told people that Josh hated being locked up so much that she thought it would be a deterrent for him in the future, and that he would think twice before threatening or hitting her. So on February 6th, Josh was released after the state dropped the charges, when Heather told them she wanted to stop pursuing it. Not long after Josh was released, Heather moved in with James, the friend who witnessed the knife incident, and told her mother that she was getting things together to file for divorce. Even though they had only been married for 6 weeks, and he spent nearly 4 of those weeks locked up, they would still have to figure out custody. Heather was hoping to get full custody so she could return to Mississippi with the children. And then, less than 2 weeks after Josh was released from jail, Heather disappeared. As best as anyone could tell, Heather got a phone call at work on February 15th from Josh. She told her coworker she had to go because something was going on with the kids. She didn't specify, but she left, and then on February 16th, she didn't show up for her shift. Over the next few days, the guy Heather was seeing, James, and her cousin Misty tried to get in touch with her. They called other friends and family members, but no one had heard from Heather. On February 24th, with no signs of Heather, Misty reported her missing. And when she did, Misty was very insistent at that time that something was wrong. She explained to the police that they already did the wait and see part to see if they heard from Heather. So now that she was reporting Heather missing, she didn't want the police to also wait before investigating. Because of how hard Misty pushed this with the police, and with Heather's estranged husband's recent arrest for threatening her life, the case actually got moved to the homicide detectives almost immediately. One of the first people they wanted to talk to was Heather's current boyfriend, James. He supposedly hadn't seen her since the afternoon of February 15th, so why didn't he report her missing? James told the police that he was concerned from the start. He was the first one to call Heather's mom to see if she knew where Heather was. But a few days after that, Josh called him and told him that he and Heather had reconciled again. Because of how their relationship had been for literally a decade, James just accepted this at face value. So if James is to be believed, Josh had seen Heather after he did. So the investigators went to see Josh, but he denied that they ever got back together. He said that he had last talked to Heather on February 15th, the same day everyone else said they last saw her. She had asked him to meet her at the truck stop where she worked, and when he got there, she had the kids and their suitcases. Heather told Josh she was in trouble somehow and needed to get out of town, though he was under the impression that she was coming back. She just needed him to keep the kids until she got her head cleared. He thought maybe she went to go stay with her family in Mississippi, or maybe she was with James, but of course the police had already checked both of those places. When the investigators couldn't find anyone who had seen Heather since February 15th, they subpoenaed her financial records. When they got those, they saw that 2 of her bank cards had been used since the time she was last seen, and all of the transactions were in the area. None of them were out of the norm, and they were just general purchases like gas and fast food, but there were also a few ATM withdrawals, and something that all ATMs have are cameras. So they went ahead and pulled that footage and looked to see who accessed the account. It was not Heather, it was Josh. After getting this footage, the investigators asked Josh to come down to the station to be interviewed on March 18th, 2009. Heather had been missing for a month. Josh told the same basic story he originally told about the gas station handoff with the kids. As far as the bank cards went, he first tried to deny that he used them at all. When he found out they had him on camera, he finally admitted that yes, he did use them, but he had Heather's permission. She had left him the cards so that he could use them to get things the kids needed while she was out of town. As goes with interrogations, the pressure started increasing on the part of the detectives, and the video in this case of that interview is pretty interesting to see because that detective, he was in Josh's personal space. They were pretty much knee to knee during this questioning. And as that pressure to tell them what happened to Heather increased, Josh said he wanted to go home. He was done answering questions and he was not being detained. But the investigators didn't believe him about any of this, and they did want to hold him. They didn't have probable cause to hold him for anything that happened to Heather because they frankly didn't know what happened to Heather. So they arrested him on fraud charges for using her bank cards. As a parent of 6 children, yes, I know that's a lot, but there are a few things over the years that I realize are real blind spots for not just me, but other parents. And one of the most important ones that will contribute to their happiness as an adult, money management. Which is why I want to thank Acorns Early for sponsoring today's episode so that I can tell you more about a tool to make this easier. Acorns Early is a smart money app and debit card for kids that helps them learn the value of money. And here's how it works. Acorns Early Chores Tracker teaches kids that hard work pays off because you set up chores in the app, set the payment amount, and then just check it off when it's done. Acorns Early lets parents pay allowances automatically. No more rummaging around for cash or forgetting entirely. And then kids can spend what they earn with their very own debit card. And what a sense of independence this gives them. Plus, they have tons of designs they can choose from, which is always fun. Parents can keep track of where and when their kids are spending because you'll get real-time spend notifications, and you can even set spending limits. And there's more. Your kid can set a savings goal. They can do fun, interactive courses within the app to help them learn about money. And I am so glad there is a tool like this out there for my younger kids. As my older kids are adults, I can see where those gaps in knowledge about money and money management has really impacted them. Ready to help your kids learn the value of money? Just head to acornsearly.com/crimelines or download the Acorns Early app to get started. Sign up now and your first month is on us. Terms and conditions apply. Monthly subscription fee starting from $5 a month unless canceled. As Josh was emptying his pockets to be taken to lockup, he was about to hand over his wallet, but instead asked if he could bring it to his mother and see his kids first. What the detectives heard their suspect saying was that he wanted something, and they certainly weren't going to give him anything without getting something in return. They pushed Josh and said that they would let him see his mom and kids, but he had to give them more information. And it wasn't long before Josh folded and agreed to tell them where Heather's body was. Now, Josh said he didn't kill her, but he knew who did, and the investigators did not want to give Josh time to change his mind, so they got him in the car immediately and had him lead them to Amelia Carr's mother's house, which is where Amelia was living. Josh said that Amelia had called him one day and told him that she had attacked Heather in the storage trailer behind her mother's house, but by the time he got out there, Heather was already dead, so he helped Amelia bury the body. While out on the property, Josh pointed out an area in the yard that had a pile of brush and random debris over it. The investigators grabbed a stick and poked around a bit, and they could feel that the dirt in that area was soft. It had been recently overturned. They then worked to get a warrant, and a crime scene team came out. When they excavated the site on March 19th, they started pulling away the debris and found 2 pieces of wood and plastic bags over a certain area. Digging in that spot, they uncovered the body of 26-year-old Heather Strong, buried just 3 feet down. Her body was partially in a large zippered suitcase and partially wrapped in a blanket. On autopsy, it was discovered that Heather had a contusion to her forehead, bad enough that it probably hurt, but not bad enough to have killed her. She had actually died from suffocation. At the time Heather's body was found, I'm under the impression that Amelia was already at the station being questioned, because we know she did not know that the body was found. All the police told her was that they had more information, which led to more questions. Amelia again denied knowing where Heather was and stuck to the story of Heather just leaving the kids with Josh and skipping town. So then they decided they were going to play her a clip of Josh's interview with them. It was the clip of Josh saying that he got that phone call from Amelia telling him that it was done and that he didn't have to worry about Heather taking the kids from him, running off, or putting him in jail ever again. Everything was taken care of. Amelia realized in that moment, hearing this recording, that Josh had fully thrown her under the bus to save himself. And she told the detectives that what Josh told them was not true. She asked, why would she throw away her entire life for a guy she was, quote, screwing around with on and off for a couple of years? And this is when they dropped the bombshell. They told her that Heather's body had been found in her mother's backyard on the property she was living at. And Amelia decided to return the favor in Josh's direction, and she offered to give them Josh on a silver platter. Amelia told the detectives that Josh had been staying with her for a few days, from February 13th until the 15th. He left on the 15th around 2 p.m. and then didn't come back until the next morning. And when he did, it was just to tell her that he loved her and that he was heading to work. Later that day, Amelia went out to the storage trailer to get something and saw Heather's body. To explain the exact scene to the detectives, Amelia went out to the storage trailer with them and walked them through her walking into the trailer, noticing that a window was broken, and then walking back until she saw Heather duct taped to an office chair with a bag over her head. She said she checked for a pulse, and not finding one, she left. When Amelia talked to Josh later, he confessed to having killed Heather. He said that he was back there with Heather, they were fighting about custody, and then he killed her. As for why Amelia hadn't told the police any of this earlier, she said it was because Josh threatened her. If he could kill Heather, he could and would kill her too. After telling the investigators this story, Amelia asked to leave and she was allowed to go home. They decided to then interview Josh again, who was still in custody because of those fraud charges. And the investigators decided that they would go ahead and play the two against each other one more time. And they told Josh that Amelia put everything on him. When Josh heard Amelia's version of events, he said that is not what happened. And now he told a different story, one that implicated both of them. According to this version of events, Josh went to his mother on February 15th and asked for her to draw up a written agreement for custody. He told her that Heather was moving back to Mississippi and was willing to give him custody in exchange for $500. His mother, unaware that this was not true, wrote the letter so that Heather could sign it. Heather had actually told Josh the opposite of this. Yes, she planned to move back to Mississippi, but she was taking the kids with her. She wanted Josh to give up custody. Josh just wanted a way to keep Heather from taking the kids out of state. And the best way he thought to go about this would be to threaten Heather enough that she would agree to sign that piece of paper. So Josh called Heather, and according to him, he told her that he knew Amelia's family kept a sizable amount of cash, about $1,700, in that storage trailer in the back of the property. He wanted her to come out and help him look for it, and she agreed. Of course, this is only according to Josh. We really don't know what he said to get Heather out there. He had a motive to make everyone in the story look bad so that he looked less bad, so it's very possible that he was lying just to paint her as a thief. Based on what her coworker said, she told them she was leaving because of something to do with the kids, which is generally the only reason Heather would have left work early. And those kids would have been the ultimate lure here, so I half suspect that he did say something about the kids, and that's why she went out there. Anyway, Josh said they were both out there, they went inside the trailer, and he asked Heather if she could sit down so they could talk about custody. This was not a calm discussion, but rather a full-blown argument, and Heather got up to try to leave. As Heather was walking away from Josh, Amelia walked into the trailer, which according to Josh was actually pre-arranged. Amelia knew Heather was going to be there and was supposed to come in after they were in there for a few minutes. I think it's also possible that Heather tried to leave because Amelia came in, especially since Amelia had just 1 month before this pulled a knife on her. Heather started to try to make a break for it, getting to the door, but she was being blocked, so she hit the window and it broke. Amelia was holding a flashlight that she used to hit Heather with, which is what left the laceration on her forehead. Heather stumbled a bit after being hit so hard, so Josh grabbed her, sat her in the office chair, and they both worked to hold Heather still while they duct taped her wrists and her ankles to the chair. Josh's story continues that they forced Heather to sign the paper, and then when she did, Amelia put a plastic bag on Heather's head, and Amelia duct taped it around her neck to hold it there. Heather was fighting for her life, so Josh sat on her lap trying to keep her from moving, while Amelia, deciding it was taking too long, put her hand on the bag where Heather's mouth and nose were and held her hand there until Heather stopped moving. Then they left her body there overnight and buried her in the yard the next morning. Josh said that killing Heather was not his plan when he took her out there that day. He only intended to scare her into giving him custody. It was Amelia who escalated things, and Amelia who did most of the actual attack on Heather. But Josh admitted he was there and that he participated. Of course, the investigators were really wanting to take Amelia into custody at this point, but they actually needed more. All they had was the word of her co-conspirator who was trying to save his own skin. And the forensic evidence had not pointed towards Amelia being there. They only found one usable print on the duct tape when the evidence came back on March 20th, and it was Josh's. All of the other evidence, like hairs and blood and such, were all Heather's. So they needed to keep investigating. But it wouldn't take long before they got a huge break when Josh's sister Michelle called the police. Amelia had reached out to her to see if she would be a go-between so that Amelia could get messages to and from Josh in lockup. Michelle notified the police of this request, and they asked her if she would help them out. They asked if they could wire up her car while she and Amelia talked about the murder. And Michelle agreed. So on March 24th, Amelia got into Michelle's car while the police were nearby and listening in. Michelle told Amelia that in order to help both of them, she would need to know everything. Amelia first denied involvement, saying that if she knew what happened, did Michelle really think that Amelia would have left Heather's body in her backyard? But then Michelle told Amelia that Josh had already told her that they suffocated Heather. And seeing that Michelle knew what happened, Amelia started talking. Amelia's overall story was similar to Josh's, but she said something else. Amelia said that she first tried to twist Heather's head to break her neck, but it didn't work. Michelle asked her why in the world would she do that, and Amelia said she thought it would be quick and painless. Amelia told Michelle that her plan was to lead the police to 2 other people, including Heather's boyfriend, James, because the police were already looking in that direction. She said she knew it wasn't okay to do that, but the only way she and Josh could stay out of prison and keep their kids was if the police did not figure out what really happened. And so Josh needed to keep his mouth shut. The story about trying to pin the murder on other people was not actually true. Amelia had, since Heather's body had been found, called the police a few times to try to make a deal. She said Josh killed Heather and she would give them the full story if she could get immunity. She fully intended on letting Josh go down for this, but she certainly wasn't going to tell his sister that. Michelle finally asked Amelia outright, "Did you help in relation to the killing of Heather?" And Amelia said, yes, she helped. And that's when the police, listening nearby, moved in and arrested Amelia. After her arrest, Amelia spoke with the police, and she first tried to deny she was involved in what happened with Heather at all, so they played her the recording of her conversation with Michelle. Amelia had not connected the timing of her arrest back to that conversation, probably because she didn't think Michelle would work with the police against her own brother. But truly, it is people like Michelle, the ones who will prioritize the victim and justice, even if the killer is their family member, that solve cases every day. And thank goodness for people like Michelle. And now Amelia was backed into a corner, so she told the police her version of what happened. And it started earlier on February 15th when Josh called her and asked her if she was still down with what they previously talked about. She knew that he was referring to a previous conversation that they had about killing Heather, a conversation she did not take seriously, so Amelia said, yeah, sure, whatever. It wasn't until Josh showed up with Heather that she realized he was actually going to do something. And from there, her story was similar to Josh's, except on a few key points. Where Josh said Amelia hit Heather with the flashlight, she said Josh did it. And he did it repeatedly. Every time Heather said something he didn't like, he would hit her again. And as for holding Heather's mouth and nose closed, Amelia said it was Josh who did that, whereas he said she did. Amelia tried to push as much blame onto Josh as possible, but she did make some very serious admissions. She admitted to trying to break Heather's neck, getting the plastic bag to put over Heather's head, ripping the tape off that Josh used to put around Heather's neck, and she admitted to doing nothing to stop the murder. For some reason, Amelia thought by saying that Josh did the actual killing, it would mean she would not be charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping right alongside him. But of course she was. At nearly 8 months pregnant, 24-year-old Amelia Carr was taken into custody. And she was shocked. She thought she was giving a witness statement, not confessing to a crime. But you know who could have told her that her statement was implicating her in a murder? A lawyer could have, but she didn't ask for one. So Amelia was in custody when she gave birth, and she did so while shackled to the bed and not able to have any family around. And of course, Josh was not allowed to be there. She held her baby for 15 minutes before they took the baby to the nursery, and Amelia was then discharged from the hospital. Within 6 hours of giving birth, Amelia said she was returned to lockup and kept in isolation. I know it's hard to care so much in a situation with a woman who did what we know Amelia did to another mother, but this was the protocol whether the woman was locked up for a brutal murder or whether they were there because they couldn't make bail on a breaking and entering. A lot of U.S. states are moving away from these degrading and honestly traumatic ways of forcing prisoners to give birth. But in 2009, this was the norm, and it does still happen today, even though we know that a woman in labor benefits from the freedom of movement, and this restriction of being shackled to a bed leads to poorer outcomes for both the woman and the baby. I live in a state where the shackling of pregnant women has been banned, but only in state prisons. And now we do have a state senator who is trying to get this expanded to city and county lockup as well, because here in Missouri, the law banning this from state prisons has been in effect for 7 years. So we have 7 years of data to show that this absolutely does not cause any safety concerns, and that the Department of Corrections was able to do this without a lot of policy changes. So if you are in Missouri and you do support that, you can send an email or call your state senator to let them know that. But we need to move on in this case because the state pretty quickly moved to another controversial topic in criminal justice, and that's when they announced they intended to pursue the death penalty. The trials were severed, and Amelia was up first. Before the trial even happened, the state offered her life without parole if she pleaded guilty, but she said no. She was recanting her confession and pleading not guilty. At Amelia's trial, which occurred in November and December of 2010, the state painted her as the mastermind in this whole thing. She knew Josh was never going to be fully with her as long as Heather was around. The breakup, get back together cycle would continue, and the only way she and Josh could be together was if Heather was dead. That was Amelia's motive. Heather's boyfriend at the time of her death, James, testified about the time Amelia put a knife to Heather's throat. He also told the jury, along with another friend named Jason, that in early January of 2009, while Josh was locked up for the assault, Amelia offered them $500 if they would help her kill Heather. She wanted them to get Heather drunk so that she could snap her neck. The state also had Amelia's friend Christy testify about how Amelia would call her crying while Josh was in lockup in January and talk about how much she loved him and couldn't see a life without him, particularly with a baby on the way. Amelia said she was looking for someone to kill Heather for her because, given how pregnant she was, she couldn't imagine moving Heather's body afterwards if she did it by herself. These comments were so over the top that Christy just assumed Amelia was venting out of frustration and not actually looking for a hitman. And that was part of Amelia's defense. She did talk about having Heather killed or wanting her killed, but she said the same things about her ex-husband, and he was alive and well. She denied she offered anyone any money. Amelia did take the stand in her own defense to explain all of this to the jury, and she said that she only confessed because the police threatened to leave her children in foster care if she didn't give them something. Social services had taken the kids when Heather's body was found, so Amelia knew that if she didn't give the police something, she was not getting them back. She had to get this case closed so she could move her custody case along. But Amelia, because she didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't realize that the story she was giving implicated her in the murder. Amelia said she knew nothing as far as the actual murder went. She never saw Heather's body in the trailer, and she certainly was not in there with Josh. She had lied about all of it, only giving the information to Michelle, Josh's sister, so that Michelle would tell it to the police, and it would eventually lead to her getting her kids back. In fact, Amelia said she knew so little about the murder that she couldn't even say for sure that Josh was the one who killed Heather. She just didn't know. As for the phone calls she said that Josh made asking if she was ready to put their plan in motion, she said that's not what the phone call was about. He was actually trying to pressure her into putting their baby up for adoption, and they had an argument, but it had nothing to do with Heather. One of the issues with Amelia's news story that she knew nothing was that she had given the police more than just a narrative. She gave details, like describing the clothes Heather was wearing that day and the blanket she was buried in. She even gave them Heather's shoes that she said Josh had taken off of Heather's feet in order to tie her to the chair. In the end, the evidence against her was just too overwhelming. On December 7th, 2010, the jury found Amelia guilty of first-degree murder. And then, to give a sentencing recommendation to the judge, they voted 7-5 in favor of death. In Florida at the time, the jury gave the recommendation, and as long as it was a simple majority like this, the judge could sentence the person to death or disregard the recommendation and sentence them to life. As in all cases like this, the judge weighed the aggravating and mitigating factors, and the state's aggravating circumstances here were pretty straightforward. They said that the murder was especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel, that it was cold, calculated, and premeditated, and that it took place during the commission of the separate offense of kidnapping. All of those were true. Heather really and truly suffered through this attack and the relatively slow process of suffocation. For mitigating factors, the defense presented evidence that Amelia had been sexually abused, not just by her father, but also by her grandfather. Her father went to prison over the abuse, and while he was there, he tried to have Amelia killed along with her mother and sister. And this isn't just an accusation, he ended up pleading guilty for it. The level of trauma that would inflict on a kid is hard to even measure. The defense also had a forensic psychologist testify that although Amelia had no mental illness or not a serious one, she did have a flat affect, and that would account for her seeming to be unemotional even when discussing truly terrible and disturbing things, like abuse or Heather's murder. This was an effect of the PTSD she suffered and should not be interpreted as her not caring. Amelia had been a good student in school when she was younger, in spite of everything she went through, and she seemed headed towards college when she got pregnant at 16 and dropped out. She then married the father of her child. He was in his early 20s, and that marriage was abusive and ended in divorce. Something not entirely in Amelia's favor was when the psychologist testified that Amelia has superficial relationships with men and tends to remain independent and in control during them. She had an IQ of 125 compared to Josh's IQ, which was in the lower 80s. So Amelia was more likely to be the leader than the follower, more likely to be the manipulator than the manipulated. And that may have been a factor when on February 17th, 2011, the judge granted Amelia just one statutory mitigator, and that was her lack of criminal history. The only trouble she had been in was related to an ex-husband who had stolen exotic birds, and it was definitely not a violent crime. As far as other mitigating factors outside of that, including her childhood sexual abuse, the judge didn't give much weight to any of it over the aggravating factors. So Amelia Carr was sentenced to death. Then it was time for Josh's trial. The state dropped the fraud charges for using the bank cards and were focused just on the murder and kidnapping charges. Josh offered to plead guilty in exchange for life, the same deal the state had offered Amelia, but the state wouldn't take it. It's not that they thought Josh was more culpable, it's that they thought he was basically at least equally as culpable, and they had gotten the death penalty in Amelia's case with basically the same set of facts, and they thought they could do it again. With separate trials, not only are the defendants more free to point the finger at each other, the state was able to tailor their theory of the crime. In Josh's trial in April of 2012, they tried to paint him as the manipulator over Amelia, a reversal of the roles from what they said in Amelia's case. Josh's defense wasn't that he didn't do it, but that it fell into the realm of second-degree murder, meaning it happened during a heightened state of emotion and it was not something he had planned. A huge piece of the state's case against Josh for premeditation were his recorded phone calls from when he was locked up in January of 2009 on that assault charge. The first person he called from jail was Amelia, and he said on that call that he should have killed Heather. In another call, Josh said he was thinking about things and asked Amelia if her neighbors could see the area behind her house, the backyard where the trailer was. She said no, there was too much tree coverage, and asked why he wanted to know. Knowing that he was being recorded, Josh said they'll talk when he gets out of jail. They also had the recorded calls between Josh and Heather, where Heather said she knew that Josh would kill her and that he was capable of it. But Josh's attorney argued that this was not planned and those calls didn't prove it was. The defense argued that Josh only intended to get Heather to sign over custody of the kids. Does it really make sense that he thought he could threaten her into a custody arrangement and things would be settled? No. But Josh's attorney said that Josh and the others in the situation were dysfunctional people. So what they did and their intentions don't always make sense. They said it was Amelia who escalated things to murder. Yes, Josh did sit on Heather while she was on the chair, which made him culpable, but not guilty of premeditation. The state, though, pointed out that Josh didn't have to premeditate before he entered that trailer because according to Florida law, premeditation can happen at any point leading up to the murder. He didn't grab a gun and shoot her in the middle of an argument. He sat on Heather for some time as she died. He knew she would die if he didn't do something. And the state argued that it was in those minutes that Josh had time to reflect on what he was doing. That time for reflection was his time for premeditation. Also, Josh had made a comment to the police that he didn't think he would have killed Heather if he hadn't found out that she had been with someone else while he was locked up. So Josh's own words pointed in the direction of first-degree murder. So unsurprisingly, the jury found Josh guilty. As for sentencing, the aggravated factors were the same as Amelia's case, and the mitigating ones were pretty similar too. Josh had an abusive childhood, with his mom testifying that she didn't do the best job at protecting him after she married a series of abusive men who hit not just her, but her children as well. Josh had also been the victim of sexual abuse by an older sibling, and he had a number of head injuries as a child. As far as education went, Josh struggled. He had to repeat both the 4th and 5th grades, putting him 2 years behind his peers, and his mother eventually attempted to homeschool him, which was not a success. From then on, he was in and out of school and on and off drugs. The defense had several psychologists testify about how Josh's abuse in his childhood led to PTSD, which then led to drug use. His head injuries also contributed to an inability to control his emotions. That was then exacerbated by heavy meth use. Josh's IQ, after all of this damage to his brain, was 81. Because the sexual abuse Josh suffered was from an older sister, one psychologist testified that Josh was prone to being manipulated by stronger and savvier women. Women like Amelia Carr. So in a vote of 8-4, the jury recommended life in prison, and that's what the judge gave him. Amelia ended up using Josh's sentence in her appeal. She argued it simply was not fair that the state presented the same case against both of them for the same crime, and Josh got a lighter sentence. This was a unique case in that the aggravating and mitigating circumstances were very similar given their shared history of abuse. And Josh was, at the very least, equally as culpable as Amelia, but likely more culpable. Josh was physically abusive to Heather long before Amelia ever met them, so that violence was not started by her. Amelia also argued that the 7-5 jury recommendation for death was unfair, since if it was 6-6, the recommendation would have been life, and one vote shouldn't hold that much weight. And pointing out the jury split was a good argument here. I have some quick stats for you, courtesy of the Ocala Star-Banner, which will be linked to my sources. But in Florida, from 1972 until 2000, there were 112 death penalty cases where the jury voted 12-0 in favor of death. In looking at the sentence appeals, the higher court affirmed them 64% of the time. But in the 117 death penalty cases with a 7-5 split, like Amelia had, the court only affirmed them 47% of the time. And if you look at the splits between 7-5 and 12-0, the likelihood of having the sentence affirmed gradually increased with every vote. So it's clear that when the Florida Supreme Court looked at death penalty appeals that showed up before them, the split of the jury's vote mattered to them. So pointing it out was a good strategy. However, Amelia lost on this appeal. The court actually opted not to comment on Josh not getting the death penalty, only saying that they didn't see any reason why Amelia shouldn't have gotten it. Amelia continued to appeal, as happens in death penalty cases, but she ended up getting a little help. In 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Hurst v. Florida that Florida's sentencing recommendation process was unconstitutional. This was largely a procedural issue. Florida would not have the jury find on the facts of the aggravating factors, but rather let the judge do it, and that violated the Sixth Amendment to have a jury decide. So Amelia's case, along with many others, had to be resentenced. The state could pursue another penalty phase trial and have a jury be the fact finders and then render a sentencing decision. Or they could save the money, fuss, and hassle and just drop the death penalty entirely and resentence to life in prison. In Amelia's case, possibly because the recommendation was just one vote above what was required at the time, they decided not to go to the time and expense of a penalty phase and just gave her life. Florida's capital sentencing statute has changed a few times over the years to comply with the law. They changed it after the Hurst decision to say that the jury had to find the aggravating factor unanimously, and then at least 10 had to recommend death. It was changed again when a Florida court gave an additional ruling on how Hurst needed to be applied and said that the recommendation for death also had to be unanimous. But then, in 2023, it was changed for the third time in 7 years. They dropped the unanimous jury requirement for the death sentence recommendation. They still needed it for determining the aggravating factor, but to recommend death, it only had to be an 8-4 majority, which makes Florida's jury recommendation threshold the lowest in the nation. Most states that allow a jury to recommend a sentence like this require it to be unanimous. The exceptions are Florida and Alabama's majority is 10. Under any of these changed and continually changing laws, Amelia Carr would not have been given a death sentence, so I think it makes sense to have just commuted it to life. Amelia does continue to advocate for her wrongful conviction, saying that not only is she not guilty, she can now prove it. In 2014, Josh signed an affidavit largely exonerating her, saying that he did it and dragged her into it. As we've seen in other cases like the John Juca appeals from a few years ago and the Carl Drew appeals from the Fall River series just a couple weeks ago, recanted testimony is not often persuasive. You're basically presenting witnesses who admit to having lied once, so there's already a credibility issue. And of course, Josh didn't actually testify against Amelia. It was her own story, implicating herself that the jury heard and used to convict her. So far, her appeals have not gotten her a new trial, and as of this recording, Amelia Carr remains incarcerated at the age of 40. And as for 43-year-old Josh Fulgham, he also remains incarcerated, but he has another conviction since going to prison. In 2016, he was given 15 years for an aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. That happened while he was behind bars. But with 2 life sentences, those 15 years really won't mean much unless he won an appeal, which is nearly impossible at this point. And as for Heather Strong's 2 children, the ones who lost so much in all of this, they were adopted and allowed to grow and heal with the privacy they deserve.